Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Omni-Americans, Some Alternatives to the Folklore of White Supremacy, by Albert Murray, narrated by Mirron Willis. The individual stands in opposition to society, but he is nourished by it, and it is far less important to know what differentiates him than what nourishes him. Like the genius, the individual is valuable for what there is within him. Every psychological life is an exchange, and the fundamental problem of the living individual is knowing upon what he intends to feed. André Malraux. Introduction. In a general sense, perhaps all statements are also counterstatements. Even the simplest pronouncements, for example, whether of measurable fact or of a point of view, are also assertions to contradict something that is assumed to be otherwise. Perhaps even the most objective descriptions, definitions, and formulations, as well as being implicit protestations against subjectivity, imprecision, and fantasy, are in effect counteractions against the void of the undefined, unformulated, and confusing. It may be then that such opening remarks as are found in the forewords to books are really answers before the questions, nay, replies, retorts, and refutations to exceptions that are not only bound to be taken, but in a sense already have been. In the same general sense, statements may also be restatements. For instance, on close inspection, affirmation for one thing not only is an inevitable negation of something else, but may also be a revision and extension. Seldom does unanimity stop with a simple yes or no. A concurring yes, that is to say, is not only a dissenting no to a different set of yeses, but may also be a modification or adaptation that rephrases an implicit, perhaps unrecognized question. Even the most casual personal introductions are counterstatements of a sort. Names exist to counteract confusion of identity and intention in the first place. Thus, even as an author, for example, tells you his name, he declares his position and involves himself in opposition. Any name will do, of course, even the illiterate X, designed as his mark, for instance. Nor are chance extensions of, or chance associations with, or puns upon any name without functional significance. Martin Luther King was a Martin Luther, a reformer in rebellion against orthodoxy. For example, at a time when an ever-increasing number of writers seems to mistake the jargon of social science for insight into the nature and condition of man, if the name of a brown-skinned U.S. Negro student of fiction and Americana reminds a few readers, by whatever chance, of Gilbert Murray, the great English author of The Rise of the Greek Epic and 5 Stages of Greek Religion, and suggests, no matter how remotely, that the study of ritual might be a means of coming to terms with some of the ambiguities of human nature and conduct that may be outside the scope of current survey methodology, such an association might be far from the intentions of that brown-skinned student. If the juxtaposition further suggests to those who, perhaps unwittingly, have oversubscribed to social science, that interpretations of human behavior in the raw require at least as much respect for the complexity of human motives as the interpretation of a poem, or play, or a story, well, perhaps one might not even need to bother with saying anything other than one's name. But at the risk of being overly explanatory, let me be definite about the statements, counterstatements, restatements that have gone into the making of The Omni-Americans, a book whose very title is intended as no small counterstatement. 2. The essays, commentaries, and reviews out of which The Omni-Americans has been built are all intended as counterstatements and restatements in the generic sense. Their most general significance should be suggested by the title. To race-oriented propagandists, whether white or black, the title of course makes no sense. They would have things be otherwise. But the United States is, in actuality, not a nation of black people and white people. It is a nation of multicolored people. There are white Americans, so to speak, and black Americans, but any fool can see that the white people are not really white, and that black people are not black. They are all interrelated one way or another. Thus the title, The Omni-Americans, is, among other things, an attempt to restate the problem formulated by the report to the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, by suggesting that the present domestic conflict and upheaval grows out of the fact that in spite of their common destiny and deeper interests, the people of the United States are being misled by misinformation to insist on exaggerating their ethnic differences. The problem is not the existence of ethnic differences, as is so often assumed, but the intrusion of such differences into areas where they do not belong. Ethnic differences are the very essence of cultural diversity and national creativity. In the context of the so-called national dialogue on the nature and implications of black experience, the counter-statements of the Omni-Americans are specifically forensic in intent. Each, that is to say, was written in an effort to make, so to speak, an affirmative rebuttal to negative allegations and conclusions about some aspects of Negro life in the United States. As a result, they become not only somewhat argumentative from time to time, but also, and quite deliberately, polemical. Unlike the standard polemics of black American protest, however, they are immediately concerned not so much with political injustice, as such with inaccuracies and misconceptions that contribute to and even rationalize injustice. They question and dispute the reliability, validity, and comprehensiveness of information. They challenge and restate the issues. They suggest alternative points of view, and they seek to provide a basis for action which is compatible with those facts that, in instances when Negroes are not involved, are generally assumed to represent the universal element in all human nature. In directing themselves toward action, these polemics, one would hope, are to be distinguished from the polemics of moral outcry, such, for instance, as are found in the well-known works of Richard Wright and James Baldwin, two of the most powerful exponents of protest/accusation since the days of Émile Zola. The work of these writers, who will be the subject for further examination, seems to be designed to make those toward whom it is directed, that is, white racists, feel guilty and fearful. White men, listen, or be damned. Take heed and mend your sinful ways, because if you don't, I foresee fire and brimstone next time, and believe me, you're going to get just what you deserve. Producing guilt may or may not be fine, but stimulating intelligent action is better, and intelligent action always needs to have its way paved by a practical estimate of the situation. The immediate objective of the polemics of the Omni-Americans is to expose the incompetence and consequent impracticality of people who are regarded as intellectuals but are guided by racial bias rather than reason based on scholarly insight. How is it that you white people who otherwise seem to be so knowledgeable and competent are suddenly so obtuse about something that is as obvious as the fact that human nature is no less complex and fascinating for being encased in dark skin? Don't you know that the direction of such stupidity is just the kind of general confusion that will destroy all of us? Don't you even know that prisoners sleep better than jailers? Get wise. As of now, you are working against your own interest as much as that of your black compatriots. Furthermore, to the extent that your misdefinitions are picked up by Negroes, you are only aggravating the problem. This just simply is not the time for the politics of unexamined slogans. The prime target of these polemics is the professional observer/reporter, that major vehicle of the nation's information, alas, who relies on the so-called findings and all too inclusive extrapolations of social science survey technicians for their sense of the world. The bias of the Omni-Americans is distinctly pro-literary. It represents the dramatic sense of life as against the terminological abstractions and categories derived from laboratory procedures. Its interests, however, are not those of a literary sensibility at odds with scientific method. Not by any means. On the contrary, a major charge of the argument advanced here is that most social science survey findings are not scientific enough. They violate one's common everyday's breeze-tasting sense of life precisely because they do not meet the standards of validity, reliability, and comprehensiveness that the best scientists have always insisted on. As a result, they provide neither a truly practical sociology of the so-called black community nor a dependable psychology of black behavior. At any rate, the counter-formulations posed in the Omni-Americans are expressions of a sensibility structured, no matter how imperfectly, by science as well as literature. They are submitted as antidotes against the pernicious effects of a technological enthusiasm inadequately counterbalanced by a literary sense of the ambiguities and absurdities inherent in all human experience. To the literary sensibility, which is geared not to categorical jargon, but to such universal patterns of human behavior as emerge from stories of suspenseful trials and instructive errors, the problems created by the misapplication of data are no less social than intellectual. The over-enthusiastic use of the highly specialized concepts of clinical psychology to define social conditions that are obviously beyond the controlled observation of the laboratory, and to do so without having established a criterion for normal limits, results in oversimplification. Like the glib pseudo-terminological use of such cliches as the ghetto, minority group, middle-class Negro, and so on, it can never do justice to the facts of life. And as in the courtroom, doing justice to people goes hand in hand with doing justice to the evidence involved in their case. The Omni-Americans is based in large measure on the assumption that since the negative aspects of black experience are constantly being overpublicized, and to little purpose except to obscure the positive, justice to U.S. Negroes, not only as American citizens, but also as the fascinating human beings that they so obviously are, is best served by suggesting some of the affirmative implications of their history and culture. After all, someone must at least begin to try to do justice to what U.S. Negroes like about being black, and to what they like about being Americans. Otherwise, justice can hardly be done to the incontestable fact that not only do they choose to live rather than commit suicide, but that, poverty and injustice notwithstanding, far from simply struggling in despair, they live with gusto and a sense of elegance that has always been downright enviable. But then perhaps only works of fiction on the scale of Tolstoy, Joyce, and Thomas Mann can truly do justice to the enduring humanity of U.S. Negroes, people who, for instance, can say of their oppressors, "Yeah, we got our troubles all right." But still in all, if white folks could be black for just one Saturday night, they would never want to be white folks no more. By which is not implied that white people necessarily should give up any wealth and power, but, after all, the overwhelming majority of white people are neither wealthy nor powerful. Maybe black assets are so seldom mentioned in books by most other U.S. Negro writers because such things are simply taken for granted. Underlying every allegation of the Omni-Americans, however, is the frank contention that the time for accentuating the positive and eliminating the negative is long overdue. This case for the affirmative is presented in 3 parts. Part 1, which consists of the title essay, begins with a discussion of the so-called question of black identity in terms of the cultural dynamics involved in the formation of the national character of the United States as a whole, moves on to an indictment of those theorists and social welfare technicians whose statistics-oriented interpretations of black experience add up to what functions as a folklore of white supremacy and a fake lore of black pathology, and concludes with a review intended as a stimulus and rudimentary orientation for more extensive investigation and development by scholars and creative writers alike of the actualities and potentialities of black American experience, as such elements are reflected in the blues idiom, one of the art styles most characteristic of U.S. Negro self-expression. All of the reviews, articles, and pop-off exercises in Part 2, The Elusive Black Image, were specifically intended as non-fiction countersketches, as it were, or indeed as sketch page erasers of images that were unlikenesses. This material was written on various occasions between 1964 and 1969, and in some instances has been revised and expanded for inclusion here. Together, the selections are meant to define a continuing concern with the ways in which writers who are advertised as scholars produce social science fictions instead of scientific information, and how writers who are advertised as storytellers and artists produce pseudo-scientific social theories. The reflections on Black studies, Black consciousness, and Black heritage in Part 3 represent extensions and applications of an assumption that is implicit in the definition of the Omni-American, that the function of education in the United States is to develop citizens who are fully oriented to cultural diversity and are not hung up on race. 3. When issues engage widespread public attention, the so-called national dialogue becomes more of a verbal free-for-all than a formally or informally structured debate. As in a battle royal, everybody is out to get in his own punchline. In such a context, the literary intellectual or would-be intellectual assumes responsibilities and takes prerogatives somewhat similar to those of a piano player in a jam session. His relationship to the argument's overall frame of reference is very much like the relationship of the piano player to the chordal structure and progression of the piece of music being used as the basis for improvisation. Of all the musicians in a jam session, it is most likely the piano player who provides the point of reference in the score. He is not necessarily the best musician in the session, but his approach, like that of the apprentice to literature, is necessarily comprehensive. Thus he is not only authorized, but obligated to remind the other participants what the musical discussion is about. Indeed, the most self-effacing accompanist did as much for Bessie Smith and for Coleman Hawkins. These are the obligations assumed here. That few writers are likely to be able to exert the definitive authority of a Duke Ellington, who, the listener will learn, is a hero of this book, is only too obvious. Nevertheless, once taking a position at the keyboard, even the novice on his first gig is required by the very nature of his responsibility to forget that he is not Duke Ellington. In any case, no matter what else he may be, the literary piano player is a would-be arranger-composer and maestro of discussions, who finds himself calling the soloists home in spite of himself. Sometimes he may even rap a knuckle here and there, almost as if he were also old Professor Clinkscales, which he definitely is not, but only in interest of the total sound and in accordance with his reading of the score, which of course is far from infallible, but at least reaches for a sense of the whole. In the context of a national dialogue, perhaps the only authorization required for putting in your little 2 cents worth is the constitutional provision for free speech. Moreover, the basis for the presumptions of dissent and counterstatement is the same as for popping off. The merest hint or suspicion that outrage is being committed against one's conception of actuality. As for intellectual or scholarly authority, perhaps it is better never to claim more than one's ideas as expressed can make self-evident. By the same token, no more will be conceded to the opposition than, say, a Negro athlete would allow an opponent who has a Ph.D. in physical education from Harvard or Yale. There is simply too little difference between official certification and media promotion as things now stand. Uptown Manhattan, 1969. Part 1. The Omni-Americans. The Omni-Americans. A Natural History. E pluribus unum. In the prelude to Joseph and His Brothers, Thomas Mann, whose awareness of context as a space-time continuum was as functional as it was comprehensive, refers to the historical background of things as being a bottomless well. He then goes on to suggest that it is bottomless indeed if what one has in mind is the background of mankind, which he describes as being a riddling essence, encompassing one's own normally unsatisfied, but quite abnormally wretched existence. The mystery of the bottomlessness past, he points out, not only includes one's own mystery, but is, in fact, the beginning as well as the end of all inquiries, and is thus also the mystery that gives immediacy to all statements and significance to all human endeavor. According to man, a bottomless or formless quality is the essential nature of the space-time continuum of human experience. The deeper one probes into the background of mankind, the further the earliest foundations of culture recede into vagueness and myth. Moreover, as Lord Raglan corroborates in The Hero, a study of tradition, myth, and drama, recent foundations have a way of receding in much the same manner. In any case, the ultimate sources of derivation almost always tend to defy scientific verification. Nonetheless, writes Mann in a passage which suggests that the whole of history itself is largely mythological, there may exist provisional origins, which practically and in fact form the first beginnings of the particular tradition held by a given community, folk, or communion of faith. And memory, though sufficiently instructed that the depths have not actually been plumbed, yet nationally may find reassurance in some prehistoric period of time, and personally and historically speaking, come to rest there. As did the memory of Joseph himself, for instance, who for his part, as Mann goes to some lengths to show, regarded a certain occurrence in Babylonia as the beginning of all things, that is, of all that mattered to him. Or more precisely, since such reassurance, whether national or personal, is always likely to be interwoven with strategic considerations, all that really mattered as an operational frame of reference. In such wise, Mann adds later in his prelude, are formed those beginnings, those time coulisses of the past, where memory may pause, and find a hold whereon to base its personal history, and hence its national myths and symbols. In other words, how far back into the past one goes in order to establish the beginning of one's own tradition or cultural idiom is not only relative, but even, at best, is also, on close inspection, very likely to be downright arbitrary and quite in accordance with some specific functional combination of desirable skills and attitudes in terms of which one wishes to project oneself. Thus there are some, many of whom are the makers of schoolbooks, who marked the beginnings of the American tradition from the time of the landings of the first Europeans in the Western Hemisphere, if not from the birth of Christopher Columbus, who never even saw the mainland. There are others for whom the settling of Virginia marked the official as well as the mythological birth of the nation. For still others, it is as if nothing of significance happened before the landing of the Mayflower. And other original beginnings have been located in the Boston Tea Party, the Battle of Bunker Hill, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitutional Convention at Philadelphia. So it goes, depending on the orientation of the historian. Constance Rourke, author of The American Humor, a study of the national character and the roots of American culture, unlike many such historians, assumed quite accurately that there were time coulisses in the pre-Columbian past that were relevant to the understanding of the American experience. Of the Boston Tea Party, for example, she wrote that it may well be a question whether the participants enjoyed more dumping the tea in the harbor or masquerading in war paint and feathers with brandished tomahawks. On the frontier, she goes on to say, the whites had adopted Indian dress and used Indian weapons, among other things, keeping the names of villages, for instance, even when the original inhabitants had been ruthlessly expelled. Nor did Constance Rourke overlook the Negro elements that have long been so deeply embedded in what she refers to as the national character. The Negro, she writes in a reference to a visit by a European to the America of 1795, was to be seen everywhere in the South and in the New Southwest, on small farms and great plantations, on roads and levees. He was often an all but equal member of many a pioneering expedition. He became, in short, a dominant figure in spite of his condition, and commanded a definite portraiture. What is more, Rourke's acclaimed scholarly investigations of the origin and development of black-face minstrels did not lead her to confuse elements of the national character with the folklore of white supremacy. Quite the contrary. Her image of the American is a composite that is part Yankee, part backwoodsman and Indian, and part Negro. In tracing this composite, she was not unaware of the profound implications of Homo Americanus as a vernacular adaptation, modification, and extension of Homo Europaeus, whom Paul Valéry once described as a combination of ancient Greek, ancient Roman, and Judeo-Christian. The three interwoven figures in the native fabric loomed large, Constance Rourke explains, not because they represented any considerable numbers in the population, but because something in the nature of each induced an irresistible response. Each had been a wanderer over the lands, the Negro a forced and unwilling wanderer. Each, in a fashion of his own, had broken bonds, the Yankee in the initial revolt against the parent civilization, the backwoodsman in a revolt against all civilization, the Negro in a revolt which was cryptic and submerged, but which nonetheless made a perceptible outline. Such figures, she goes on, were the embodiment of a deep-seated mood of disseverance, carrying the popular fancy further and further from any fixed or traditional heritage. Their comedy, their irreverent wisdom, their sudden changes and adroit adaptations provided emblems for a pioneer people who required resilience as a prime trait. So wrote Constance Rourke, whose richly informed observations on the texture of life in the United States seems to have exercised no significant influence on the so-called findings of the current crop of social science survey technicians. Nor is there any compelling evidence that her influence has been remarkably stronger among historians and literary intellectuals, most of whom, it turns out, are no less oriented to the folklore of white supremacy than are politicians. Nevertheless, so did she delineate the image and pattern of Homo Americanus, and thus did she locate the taproots of contemporary style, and so in the process define all that matters in the national character. And however provisional, as an historical coulisse or even a geographical coulisse, such is the composite wellspring from which the mainstream of American tradition derives. Whence also, and no less directly or inevitably, is derived the U.S. Negro idiom, for all its distinctive nuances. There is, of course, no question at all that the ultimate source of the dance orientation so central to the lifestyle of most contemporary U.S. Negroes lies somewhere in the uncharted reaches of some region of prehistoric Africa. But for all immediate practical purposes, the blues tradition, a tradition of confrontation and improvisation, that is, to use Rourke's word, of resilience, is indigenous to the United States, along with the Yankee tradition of that of the backwoodsman. Thus, though recognizing that the depths, which after all are bottomless, have not actually been plumbed, there is no truly urgent reason to trace the origin of U.S. Negro style and manner any farther back in time than the arrival of a Dutch ship of war in Virginia, with a cargo of 20 black captives for sale, in 1619, if indeed that far. Negroes definitely were reluctant immigrants to the New World, but in view of the life they had experienced in the land of their origin, they could hardly have regarded it as a stronghold of individual freedom and limitless opportunity, nor could they have been unmindful of the obvious fact that Africans back home were as actively engaged in the slave trade as were the Europeans and Americans. Many contemporary Americans, both black and white, obviously assumed that the slave runners simply landed their ships and overpowered the helpless natives at will. Such was not the usual case at all. For the most part, such entrepreneurs bartered for black ivory, much the same as for elephant tusks. The whites, Negro historian Benjamin Quarles points out, did not go into the interior to procure slaves. This they left to the Africans themselves. Spurred on by the desire for European goods, one tribe raided another, seized.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?